Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest GDV live event. My name is Mehreen Khan. I'm one of the Brussels correspondents for the Financial Times. And it's my pleasure today to have a great group of panelists to discuss the EU's green bond standard, a perspective from the insurance industry. This is a very timely topic given that only, I think, 18 to 24 hours ago, the European Commission launched its inaugural green recovery bond. So there is a lot of interest in this market, and hopefully we'll be able to get into the weeds, but also some of the bigger macro issues around green bond issuance. It's my pleasure, as I said, to have a wonderful set of panelists, beginning with, I think we're missing only Christoph, but he should be joining us soon. But we will start, I'll introduce everyone and then we'll get into the discussion. We have Sven Gettner, who is from DG FISMA, so he works for the European Commission as a head of unit. We also have Sobri Andreas from Munich Re. He's head of M&A. Head of M&A at Munich Re. And then finally, we have Christoph Hansen, who's a Luxembourgish MEP from the European People's Party, who's running a few minutes late, but he should be here any second now. Perhaps just to kick off the discussion, guys, maybe Sven, we can start with you. I think the EU Green Bond Standard is a phrase that more and more people seem to be familiar with. Just before the summer, the Commission launched its EU Green Bond Standard. And of course, this is all in a broader context of this burgeoning asset class. The Commission's own recovery bonds, 33% or a little bit more, will also be green bonds, and the taxonomy. So it's definitely an area where I think on the regulatory side, we see much more action, particularly from the Commission. So maybe you could just kick us off by telling everyone what the EU's Green Bond Standard is.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction and for having me on the panel. The European Green Bond Standard is really one of the key planks of our Sustainable Finance Action Plan. We are convinced that green bond issuance will have to play an important role in financing our transition to a more sustainable economy. We've seen this asset class grow over the last few years, grown quite substantially, but overall it's still a relatively small percentage of the overall bond market. So what we're trying to do with our initiative is to make sure that this segment will continue growing and will continue growing in an orderly way over the next few years. The key elements that we're introducing with this European standard is one, a clear link to the taxonomy, because now that the taxonomy is agreed, we have this kind of vocabulary that helps us identify what are really green activities, very useful for issuers of bonds, because it will lend them additional credibility when they issue a bond based on the taxonomy. And the second element is we want to make sure that the issuance is properly regulated, is properly reviewed, and that the reviewers, which are already out there in the marketplace, private entities, that they are properly supervised, to make sure that also when we go forward, when we'll continue to see a large growth in this segment, that everyone can rely on the information that is published. I think that is very important, because once trust is undermined, it's very difficult to get it back. And we want to make sure that the trust in this market segment remains.
And just to follow up, the standard is voluntary. What does voluntary mean in this context? And do you judge the success by the degree of take up? So even if it's voluntary, if it becomes incredibly popular, that's how you can, I guess, pat yourselves on the back and say, it has confidence of investors.
I think our overall goal is to make sure that this market segment works well. We've chosen to make the standard voluntary because we think it's not the time yet to put everyone in the same basket. We want to establish a high quality standard that is, if you want, the gold standard out there that others will have to compare themselves to as well. But we don't think it's necessary to force everyone to apply the same standard as at this point in time. We're also seeing a lot of innovation out there in the marketplace, different types of green bond standards being established, which is fine for us. But I think we should make sure that everyone is held to a very high standard, has to compare themselves to it. And in that sense, yes, take up, of course, is intended, and we think there will be, but I think we'll also have an effect on the market in a more general way. not just through the take-up of the standard itself.
Great, thank you. I should have said this at the beginning, but for the audience who's listening, if you have questions, please send them in. They will be, I think, if you use the hashtag on LinkedIn, and we'll be able to see them and hopefully get to them in the course of the discussion. Andreas, perhaps we can bring you in because the title of the talk is the perspective from the insurance industry, and I guess that's what you're here to provide. How are you guys at Munich Re thinking about the EU's green bond standard, not gold bond standard? That's probably what we informally call it.
Actually, also from my end, good afternoon to all of you. Thanks for the introduction. Pleasure being here. At Munich Re, the green bonds are one building block amongst many others in our approach to the transition to a more sustainable world. While it's not the only building block, it complements a much broader climate sustainability and also includes decarbonization targets for our asset and liabilities. But green bonds are really one important play an important role for Munich Re from an issuer's perspective as well from an investor or asset gatherer's perspective. Therefore, we welcome the introduction of this EU green bond standard. We welcome many facets, many aspects of this proposal. I personally think that there are some areas which might need some improvement, but in general, we as Munich Re welcome this standard.
Sure, and Sven sort of laid out the fact that there are many standards out there. Sounds like, the fear for investors that the green investing is a bit of a wild west, particularly with fears about greenwashing. So what do you want the EU's green standard to do that you don't already get from alternative standards that exist right now?
Yeah, I mean, Munich Re has already issued green bonds twice. The first one in 2020, and then back in 2020, there was no EU green standard. Therefore, we decided to issue our green bond on ISMA, and we developed a so-called green bond framework, which is published on the Munich Re website. This green bond framework actually has been approved by a third-party opinion provider, a reputable one, which is known to investors, and therefore for us it would be additional effort to follow a different standard actually.
Okay, that's interesting. So as it stands, what would incentivize you to use the EU's green bond standard? Sven sort of laid out how robust some of the reporting and the monitoring mechanisms are. Do you look at that as slightly intimidating?
Actually, what would help us to adopt or to decide to issue the next one on the green bond format? What would be very helpful if what we have done so far, in particular, the green bond framework, again, which got approval from a third-party opinion provider, would be in line or would be compliant with the EU green bond framework. And if not, then we would welcome it if we would not have to be required to do loads of adjustments. And there's already aspects of the, in our opinion, somewhat opaque grandfathering rights provision as it's currently drafted in the EU standard proposal. And also it comes down to the eligibility of activities and assets of the bonds, of the proceeds of the bonds issued. I understand that there is an alignment to the EU taxonomy intended, but the EU taxonomy is very restrictive in our view regarding the eligibility of activities. And therefore, if the new standard would be give more freedom here, this certainly would help.
That's very interesting. Sven, maybe I'll come straight back to you to answer those points. Of course, the taxonomy is a work in progress. We've had the first delegated act. We're awaiting a sort of supplementary delegated act to deal with issues like nuclear and gas. But as Andreas sort of just laid out there, that this time lag and even issues about the first delegated act might be putting off some investors. Have you also heard this from your conversations with market participants? And what's the way forward for the Commission to sort of, I guess, fix this gap?
Well, a few points in reply to that. I mean, I think the link to the taxonomy is really an essential part. Of the standard, because I mean that's also something that we've been told by the technical expert group that is advising the Commission, by other market participants when we consulted. They wanted to have clarity about what is green and what is not green. There are good approaches out there, and there may be approaches out there which are not as green as we would hope so. And I think one of the things we need in the marketplace, clarity about what is green and what is not green. That's exactly what the taxonomy set out to do. In the timing question, look, we're still negotiating the green bond standard, which will take us still a little bit of time with Parliament and Council, which have an important role to play. We will have a time for implementation. So I think by the time that the standard is in place, the taxonomy will also have further evolved, and some of the problems that people are seeing now will have gone away. And my expectation also is that the taxonomy will play a more and more important role, not just in the green bond area, but generally, because it really is the basis to identify activities and everything that is based on that in terms of telling whether they're green or not. So I'm confident that this link to the taxonomy will remain an important part.
Okay. Christoph, maybe we can bring you in just to fill you in. We sort of had some introductory remarks from Sven about what this standard is meant to achieve. How do you see it sitting from the Parliament? Of course, you're co-legislators on this. So is there any particular ideas you have that you would like to see in this standard that weren't in the Commission's proposal? I also think you're on mute, so you might have to just press unmute before we begin.
Yes, thank you very much, and sorry for being late, but we are in full preparation for the plenary session next week, and there are some issues that pop up last minute, so unfortunately I had to deal with those. So no, for us, of course, here in the European Parliament, the European Green Bonds are an essential part of the 55 package, because we need to finance the change that we want to achieve, and this is of course important to get more money in these technologies. I think this is very important. It is our tool to finance energetic transition. It is our tool to finance as well climate change, and as well we see a lot of opportunities, because if we see as well for the whole green transition, we expect to have many millions of new jobs in the European Union. And this is of course a booster for the general economy. So I think there are many points that we need to see there. So I unfortunately didn't get all the points you mentioned before, but I would be happy to come back in later on.
Yeah, maybe we can. I'll just get your views on the taxonomy, given that it seems to be quite a live debate. The Parliament, of course, even though it's a delegated act, does have the ability to reject a delegated act. How do you foresee the current debate about taxonomy, given that it seems to have got a whole new wind, given that we have an energy crisis and lots of countries are demanding a more generous treatment, for example, for natural gas and nuclear? Would that undermine the taxonomy and then de facto also undermine the green bond standard?
Well, for us, it is very important to be very clear about when you're talking about the energy prices. This is not because of our climate ambition that gas prices are going up. They are mainly going up because of a predominant role that the gas coming from Russia, from Gazprom coming in, has been blocked because of maintenance work. So this is the main factor there that we see, and for us it is important. But unfortunately, some people try to do so to hijack a little bit this discussion and come back to climate ambition. So this is, of course, for us, for a majority in the Parliament, not the way to go. We had a lot of discussions because the delegated act on taxonomy went through a plenary last week, and it was a tough game to bring it through. So because, namely, people are afraid because of the growing energy prices, but nonetheless, we have to not strengthen our dependence on fossil fuels, but we have to get more and more. Let's say we're not in need anymore. We have to get our own sources, and this is just the wrong way as well to even go higher on our dependency. We have to lower our dependency, and I think this can be achieved through the taxonomy, of course, and the EU green bonds.
Sure. Sven, the Commission said that they would come up with sort of the second delegated act in the autumn. Are we still on course, or has the debate made everything much more complicated for you?
I think we're still very much focused on this. It's we know that this is a tricky area. We know that big adjustments will have to be made. But I think the way we've gone about it in the area of financial services so far has been we want transparency. The taxonomy is not a code that says what you can do or what you can't do, but it tells you very clearly what the various activities have in terms of an effect on the environment. And then it's for financial markets to draw the consequences. And I think this can be an extremely powerful tool. I'm confident that we'll put in the missing building blocks for the taxonomy, be it on gas, nuclear, but also the 4 remaining objectives that still need to be dealt with. So far, we've only dealt with climate. But this overall approach of really leveraging, of activating the power of financial markets, once they have the information, once they can really decide what is sustainable for the future, I think that can be very, very helpful and very powerful. And it's different from an approach where you tell people what you can do or what you can't do. We're relying, if you want, to a certain extent on market forces, but for those market forces to work, we need the information and the transparency out there, which so far hasn't been the case.
Andreas, Munich Re also is a huge buyer of bonds. What are the considerations that you make when you think about which types of green assets to buy? Is the conformity to certain standards something that you have to look at?
Actually, I alluded to the fact that the entire ESG topic is a very important one for Munich Re and within Munich Re, and therefore Munich Re as an asset gathering investor really is committed to finance this transition and consequently to invest in green bonds. And we wish to invest in real green bonds, but we of course would want to avoid to invest in securities which might be said to be greenwashing or so. Yeah, we would not want to run this risk. This is obviously not our objective. And therefore, of course, we'll look at the standards the green bonds have been issued under.
So is that the main way that you check against potential greenwashing? So what are the mechanisms that you have to undergo to ensure that you're not getting duped as it stands?
I mean, all these green investments, they compete with other investments. So foremost, the risk return profile needs to fit in absolute and relative terms. That is clear. But again, due to our commitment to the transition, or to financing to transition, we also look at green assets, and therefore, if a security is labeled green, and if the labeling stems from a reputable third-party opinion provider or follows a credible, reliable standard, this of course helps and gives us comfort really to invest or to pick and choose that specific asset. And from that perspective, we also support the EU green standard.
Yeah. Sven, how much interest has the green bond standard got already? So, I mean, I know that it was only launched a couple of months ago, but what's the feedback that you have? And when can you really judge it, I guess, to be a success? And what are the metrics that you use for this?
So, the one thing is, when we consulted on our legislative proposal, we got a lot of support in those consultations. There is market appetite out there. We've also had this technical expert group, a group made up of industry representatives or representatives of other stakeholders who very clearly advised us and said, you need to put a truly gold green standard out there to help the market develop, to help raise the bar on what these bonds should look like. We're now in the middle of the negotiations. So the Commission made its proposal. We're now negotiating with Parliament, with Council. I think these negotiations are progressing well, also because there is a lot of interest also from the member states who are also convinced that they should move forward. Same thing from the Parliament side. And then what will be the success of the standard? As I said before, it's twofold. We want take up of the standard, of course, and we expect take up to happen, but we also think it can have a beneficial effect on the market in general by setting a certain standard in terms of what you need to do in terms of your greenness and in terms of how this greenness is reviewed. And I think in that sense, it can be beneficial for the market as a whole.
Thank you. Christoph, as your co-legislator, there have been some, I guess, slightly some issues raised about the standard, particularly the role the SMEs and the burden the SMEs might face in complying. Is this something that your group or the Parliament is wary of in the discussions, and will you be putting these types of questions on the table during the trilogues? Christoph, sorry, that was for you.
Sorry. No, I think what is important that maybe private issuers may as well prefer alternative green bonds and less onerous certification processes. So this is of course something what we have to take into account, and we have also as well to make sure that the compliance process and as well the reporting is as well at a certain level that is digestible for SMEs, I would say. So this is, of course, something where my political group will as well put a strong accent on when we are getting the text. Of course, we have now the text from the Commission, but we haven't seen yet a text from the rapporteur. So this might be included, but there we are probably as well getting on the agenda, yes.
How long will this process take? And are you mindful that perhaps while your negotiations are going on, that we'll also see more on the taxonomy side? Is it better to wait, in your opinion, until there's maximum certainty about what the taxonomy looks like before formally launching this standard? Christoph?
Could you just repeat, because you have been cut?
Sorry, can you hear me now? Is that good? I was just saying that is there a consideration about how long you should take with finalizing your position and then also the file, given that during those negotiations there might be some movement also on the taxonomy file. So to have maximum certainty about what you're agreeing, is it better to wait until the taxonomy is, I guess, or stage 2 of the taxonomy is completed?
Well, we are not yet there because, as you know, the files have just been distributed, and so far the rapporteur, we haven't spoken to the rapporteur yet. You know, in the Econ committee, it's Paul Tang from the S&D group that is the rapporteur, and in the Environment committee, it is Bas Eickhout from the Greens, and I'm respectively the shadow rapporteur. So, of course, it will depend on the rapporteur to determine as well the timetable. In principle, he does so in accordance with the shadow rapporteurs, but this meeting is only to take place, so I can't give you more details about his plans for the timetable. But of course, if Mr. Sauerbrei has a certain preference or consideration for that, of course, that is something that I can as well bring into the discussion if either or the other way would be better.
Andreas, do you have any preference?
Actually, if it comes to the timeline, I mean, I have to say there's a green bond standard out in the market. Munich Re used as an issuer already twice, and we already invested or are invested in green bonds. So this means there's a standard there. So we are going to have a new further standard, and my preference would be to make it most efficient from issuers and investors' perspective, really to align it also timing-wise with the introduction of the EU taxonomy. Yeah, because if you align it before the EU taxonomy comes into place, then of course you run the risk that the framework has to be amended later on the second time, and this puts more effort on the market participants. Yeah, therefore, to make it most efficient for issuers as well as for investors, I would prefer to align it also timing-wise.
So, Christoph, do you want to come back?
Yes, maybe just to be clear, maybe we have to be careful then as well in the beginning that there is in the beginning a certain flexibility that would be granted, and that it is a progressive alignment to taxonomy. I think this could eventually solve the problem as well.
Sven, maybe you've heard that there are standards that exist and they are being used, and I guess the more they are being used, the more issuers will get used to them and see them as perhaps good enough. So, is there actually some time pressure on this to get this out?
We want to move fast. I mean, not fast in the sense that not take every important points into account, but this whole area of sustainable finance plays a very, very important role. I mean, we all see the pressure that we're under in terms of adjusting our economies. We need to get the finance in place to get this done. We're happy that there are standards out there already. And as I said, this is why we developed this standard as a voluntary one. That hopefully will have a beneficial effect on the market, but we wanted to be agreed as quickly as we can. I don't really see a huge problem in relation to the taxonomy timing, because as Christoph also said, I mean, the process of co-decision does take a bit of time, and rightfully so, because we need all the various points of view to be taken into account. So I'm quite sure it will still take us a bit of time with Parliament and Council to come to an agreement. There is then also a phase for implementation. And by that time, I think we'll have all the building blocks of the taxonomy in place. So I'm not worried about the taxonomy and the green bond standard in terms of different timings. What I'm keen on is to find a good agreement as soon as possible with Parliament and with Council, because I think this standard can play a useful role out there in the marketplace.
Sure. I mean, one of the sort of buzzwords around the taxonomy is that it will evolve. Is that also slightly problematic for investors, given that the goalpost might change in a few years, and therefore the standard would have to evolve with the taxonomy? Is this the kind of things that, Andreas, I'll get to you, but maybe for Sven, maybe you can address that point first, that might be a concern.
Sure. Well, maybe 2 points. It's not just the taxonomy that is a living document. It's the whole approach that we have to the transformation of our economy. I mean, we've seen that technology changes over time. We've seen that political goals change over time. And we also know that the information in terms of our effects on the environment change over time. And I'm afraid that will keep on remaining the case. So we all know that over the next 10, 15 years, we will have to adjust our goals. We will have to adjust our approaches. And no one at this point in time knows exactly what we need to put in place in 2035 and 2040. So I think this is not just a question of the taxonomy, it's a general question. So it's only natural that the taxonomy reflects that. Having said that, we've put provisions in place in the proposal, a grandfathering clause, which at the moment says that you have a certain number of years to adjust if the taxonomy changes. Now, in the discussions, for example, with member states in the council, some member states have already said they would like to see a different approach, maybe more time. That is exactly the kind of thing that is then discussed in this co-decision process with the Parliament, with the council, to reach the best possible outcome.
Andreas, does that comfort you, hearing that there will be some provisions to make sure that there is time for the market to adjust?
Yeah, actually, I really share here Sven Gantner's view. I mean, it's natural that the paper is evolving, but it has to be adjusted over time. But then even more important is that they have a grandfathering provision, which provides legal certainty and also, if we will, economic certainty in a certain sense, to investors as well as to issuers. And we of course noted, or I of course noted, the grandfathering provision as it is drafted now. To my understanding, it runs for 5 years. In my opinion, that's too short. In my opinion, the grandfathering should cover the entire lifetime of a bond. But again, this is obviously under discussion, and therefore, yeah, grandfathering rights provisions are very important, very important element here.
Sure. Christoph, has the EPP taken any view on this issue, on the duration of grandfathering? You've heard one perspective about how it should work.
Well, today I'm not going to speak generally on the position of the EPP. Today all my views are my own so far, so I will not pronounce, because we didn't have just internal discussion yet on such details yet. So I'm just speaking on behalf of myself. But what is important, of course, is not only for the issuer, but as well for as well for the investor, that there is a certain kind of trust. And the trust, I think, is the most important thing. It is not only the trust that the projects financed are in the end really sustainable. I think that is important. But secondly, it is as well important that they have a certain security over time in where this is going. So I think we need as well there to get a certain kind of flexibility on these 5 years, maybe not until the maturity of the fund, but still I think we need something more than just the 5 years. There needs to be more flexibility as well, and more, which would of course then as well bring more security for the issuer and for the investor.
Sure. Andreas, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned that parts of the Taxonomy Delegated Act are too restrictive in what is considered to be green activity. Could you elaborate on that point about what your concerns are about what we've already seen in the text?
To my understanding, the EU standard follows, if it comes to eligibility, it follows what is written and what is stated and what is allowed under the EU taxonomy. And this investment universe is clearly smaller, more restrictive than, for instance, what is doable under ICMA / under the Green Bond Framework we have introduced and which was approved by a reputable third-party opinion provider. This was the aspect I was referring to.
Okay, thank you. Sven, we saw a green bond launch yesterday from the Commission, the inaugural recovery bond. What standard was that bond based on? I think I've heard the phrase best in class used quite a lot, but what does that mean?
For its own issuance, so this is under Next Generation EU, green bond issuance financing the recovery in the European Union. For this issuance, the Commission has developed a standard based on standards out there, like Andreas mentioned, ICMA, but also tailored to its specific needs. I mean, the obvious question, I guess, is why are we not using the EU green bond standard? Well, there are two reasons for that. The first, it hasn't been agreed yet. As we said, we made a proposal. We'll have to see where we end up after the co-decision procedure. The second one is that the issuance that the Commission is doing now is a very special one. I mean, we are basically raising funds which we're giving to member states to implement certain policies. So we have, if you want, an intermediate role here. And we also depend to a certain extent on the information that we get from the member states in terms of how they're going to spend the money. So these two factors combined, I think the right decision was taken to develop our own standard based on very high market practice. And when you look at the multiple of oversubscription yesterday and the success that this has had, I think it seems to work quite well.
Sure. I mean, there was a incredible priced, but so in the future, if we're in a world where the green bond standard has been agreed by the co-legislators and the Commission is still issuing part of its 850 billion, I think it's just over 200 billion will be green bonds. Will the standard then be used in those future issuances?
Look, I can't tell you exactly how this is going to play out. I mean, it depends on a number of factors. When will we find an agreement? How long will the issuance of the Commission run and all that? But I think for the time being, we've got a very successful approach in place.
Andreas, how does Munich Re see yesterday's issuance and the general, I guess, the Commission's entry as a major player in the sovereign green bond market with the recovery fund?
Actually, we welcome this very much because a deep and liquid green bond market would help. And if a sovereign investor really issuing large volumes, many tranches under a certain standard for green, as it was done yesterday, it is certainly helpful for the development of the asset class, and we welcome that.
Yeah, Christoph, we've seen other European sovereigns, Spain, Germany, also issue their own sovereign green bonds. Is it about time that eventually you would also want to see this standard being used for sovereign issuers in the EU to give it more credibility?
Yes, of course, the European Parliament, because I believe that we have to not do 27 different standards and legislation, then that we have to go into one single one that will be our strength. Otherwise, we will be just little fishes in a global market. So I'm always for the European solution rather than to have the national nitty-gritty solutions.
Just broadly on the recovery fund, of course, this is an issue about governance that we are yet to sort of see. But once the money really starts flowing, there will be more questions around monitoring and some of the milestones that countries have to comply with. Christoph, what do you want to see from the Commission in terms of governance and how stringent, how strict it should be, particularly on the green element? Because I think this is a very big test case for I guess, green investment in the EU going forward and what member states will be able to do or not do under money which they have earmarked for so-called green purposes.
Well, it's a very difficult question, of course. I believe that unfortunately we have as well in the use in the member states quite different appreciations what should the transition look like. But nonetheless, I think there we need a certain line, a certain flexibility for let's say for an adaptation phase. But in the end, we should still go for an as strict as possible control by the European Commission there as well.
Sure. We have about 10 minutes left. I will just jolt the audience. If you want to send in questions, please do, because we'll definitely try and get to them. Sven, just I guess sort of thinking ahead for this. This is an asset class which has a lot of attention on it. There's a lot of appetite, as we've already seen. There's a lot of media coverage around it. If you had to sort of, think about where we should be in 3 or 4 or 5 years, where should the Commission also be positioning itself in terms of this asset class? And what do you think needs to happen for this to become even bigger and much more credible than what we're seeing right now?
Well, what we would like to see is continued growth of this class, increased growth, a much higher share of bonds being issued as green that we're seeing at the moment. But for this to happen, the one thing that we absolutely need to avoid is a breakdown of trust and confidence in investment in green assets. I think there are certain risks because up to now this has been a niche market. Now it's becoming mainstream. There is money to be made. And we need to be very, very careful that going forward, the issuance that we see, the investment that we see, that is done in a proper way. And that's exactly what we're trying to address through our standard by tying it to a clear definition of what is green, what is the taxonomy, which has also been agreed at the European level with the Parliament, with the Council, based on technical expert advice, which is going to evolve, as you said, which will remain up to date. I think that's one very important element. Second important element is that the review that is being done already by private entities, that is properly supervised. The players out there, they're good ones, they're reliable, but given the size of the market that we'll see in a few years' time, I think we need to make extra sure that things don't go wrong. Because unfortunately, one bad apple can spoil the whole thing, can undermine trust even in the kinds of issuers that would not employ practices that are substandard. So we need to help the whole market keep up a high level of trust.
Sure. Just a quick follow-up. Are there sort of, we spoke about ICMA earlier, but do you have any knowledge of rival jurisdictions trying to come up with their own standards in response to the EU, or ICMA making changes to what it has? Like, are we in a process now of sort of leveling up?
I think generally we are in a process of leveling up. It's a bit difficult for me to comment on the various initiatives that are being taken in other jurisdictions. What I'm happy about at the moment is that the European Union is playing a leading role here. We don't want to be the only ones out there. We have a great interest in others doing similarly ambitious initiatives that also trying to to really frame this whole market in a way that it works well. And I think that's what we're seeing around the globe. We're seeing other jurisdictions establishing standards. And of course, as always, there will also be a need at some point to try and get these standards closer to each other. But I think at the moment, the important thing is that we make sure that our market works properly and that we continue to see the growth rates that we've been seeing and that we'll hopefully see over the next few years.
Andreas, maybe just to go to you and also perhaps some final remarks, but would you rather there be a market with many standards or perhaps just one or a few that everyone has to abide by?
Actually, I would prefer to have one standard in the end, which really, which is the established standard on the market. But which standard will be the established one, in my opinion, because we are in a free economy, so to speak, for standards, in my opinion. So the most attractive standard from issuers and from investors' perspective will succeed, will dominate in the end. Yeah, and hopefully this will be the EU standard. But maybe there are other standards. Yeah, this remains to be seen. For the time being, at least in my opinion, it's the ICMA standard right now. But this might change over time.
Sure. Christoph, okay, perhaps we'll give the final words to you. Andreas said the market will decide, but should the EU actually take that question off their hands by making the standard obligatory rather than voluntary? So then we'll know what the answer is.
Well, I believe that the voluntary basis is the right way to go, so I would not make it mandatory, firstly. And secondly, I think what is important now is that we ensure the compatibility between the European green bonds and bond standards and other taxonomies. I think this is very important to get this compatibility. Because I think it is important as well that issuers from non-EU markets would be able as well to access our EU capital markets. I think that is very important, and therefore it makes sense to me that the Commission teams up and let's say coordinates somehow as well with other international actors to promote the use of the standard. I think this is very important, and then maybe the international platform on sustainable finance could be the way forward. So I think it is important to ensure the compatibility in the first place, but as well prepare the way for a common standard.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm just checking, and it doesn't look like we have any questions from the audience, which means we're actually going to finish on time. So my last job is just to thank everyone, Andreas, Sven, Christoph, for your time. I think this is a topic which is not going away anytime soon. So you're probably going to be in high demand to keep doing this for the next few months and even few years. But thank you very much for this session. I learned a lot. Thank you, everyone who tuned in, and hopefully see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.